This is a lecture from OpenTuition.
Requirement 2 deals with really Exhibit 4 of the question, where there is part of the risk register reproduced. So the risk register shows basically a very brief description or title of the risk item, like a competitive marketplace. The manager who's in charge of dealing with this risk, for example, keeping it under review, thinking of mitigating factors, a much fuller description of the risk, and then a rating of the risk here, whether it's high or medium. And it's set out in, I suppose, what I would call typical risk register form, going across the page in the form of a table. And we are to compile now a table for the chairman and the audit and risk committees, which analyzes how the risks identified in the current risk register could have an impact on the achievement of the Dulce's strategic aims. And again, we come to these strategic aims again. Remember what they were. The strategic aims. We want growth of different types of products, and we also want to make ourselves attractive to different markets. And both of those are seen as ways, really, of expanding our sales. So I think it'd be quite good if we could, again, turn back our answer from time to time, just to show that we have taken on board what the strategic aims are and how our answer is directed at the achievement or greater chance of achievement of those strategic aims. And then recommends mitigating activities for each of these risks. Professional skills marks here looking at analysis skills in considering the risks identified by the company. And I suppose we have to think here as to maybe to what extent we think that these risks are very serious and so on as we go through their analysis skills. That's all it says. And it wants a table. I think what it wants by a table is simply for you to go down the 4 risks and then to have column 1 analysis of how the risks will affect our strategic aims, and then the next column, the final column, as saying suggested mitigating factors. I find requirement A1 here a bit peculiar, because I think once they have described the risk in the question paper, it is almost completely obvious what effect this will have on their strategic aims. So it seems you're almost restating the obvious again, but it wants you to do that. So if we take the first one here, so they're already categorized medium-high. I think 1 is a little odd, as a description of the risk doesn't leave you too much to think about. But I suppose it wants you just have to do your best. You have to try to expand it a little bit. So if we take risk 1, which was a competitive marketplace, and it says the global confectionery market has many strong players. Our competitive position depends on our continued ability to offer products which strongly appeal to consumers and which are readily available in places they are demanded. And I suppose the risk is that we do not offer products which strongly appeal to consumers, or consumers' tastes change, we don't keep up to date, and which are very restricted outlets, so consumers can't get it. And we have to say, how will this impact on the achievements of our strategic aims? Well, obviously, if you're not making products that people want, those products won't sell. They're going to become redundant. And if you're not selling products in the shops that people want to go to or online, if that's how they want to shop, you're not going to be increasing your range of market in any way. But I think we have to say that, even though it's bleeding obvious. I think it's more interesting, probably more to say, and I think more of the 16 marks there. So if we have 4 risks, 16 marks, that's probably 4 per. I would say almost, maybe 1 is for A1, maybe 3 is more for A2. What can we do about it? And the sort of things that you could mitigate this risk of losing market share that's talked about in this competitive marketplace risk would be things like keeping a very close eye on sales, looking at how products are, maybe growth is tailing off on a product and so on, doing lots of consumer surveys. You could think even promotion, new adverts and so on could be in there. Maybe producing boxes or packets of different sizes there, so that we are really doing the marketing exercise very, very closely, because that's how you keep competitive advantage, how you keep people satisfied. It's marketing. And also we need to look very carefully at, say, whether growth is increasing or decreasing in our own shops, whether it's increasing, decreasing online, whether it's increasing, decreasing in supermarkets and so on. And make sure, first of all, that we give attention to where growth is increasing, make sure that we have plenty of products to go there, and see whether or not we can re-enliven the outlets where growth might be decreasing. We need to look at price as well. All of this is to do with competitive marketplace, and these are all mitigating strategies. You could even talk, I think it's going a little bit too far maybe for the time we have available here, but the multi-buy offers, buy one get one free offers and so on, can be used from time to time to boost sales for particular products, and keeping your competitors on their toes a little bit. I just look at one other of the 4 risks in here. Look at the third one. Our products must have the highest integrity. And it's saying here that product contamination, for example, on cleanliness or impurities, could be harmful to customers. And unethical sourcing of materials, and it does talk about potential child labour and so on, exploitation of employees in countries where the chocolate is produced. Unethical sourcing of materials could severely damage our reputation. Well, again, it seems to me absolutely obvious that if you begin to sell chocolate which is of inferior quality, or which gives people, salmonella poisoning or something, that's not going to be very good for meeting your strategic aims, especially if you are projecting yourself as upmarket. And I don't think you're going to get very far by saying, well, you have an upmarket stomachache from eating our chocolate. Be grateful it's not a downmarket stomachache. There's maybe a little bit more to expand on ethical sources of materials. I think you could say now that maybe people are becoming more concerned about fair treatment of producers. There are all sorts of schemes around in supermarkets, for example, if you're buying tea, chocolate, this, that and the other, certainly in the UK, some are labelled fair trade, where they promise that the farmers responsible for growing the material get decent prices, that we're not exploiting them. And people, I think, are increasingly taking note of the sources of material. But I think you could also need to be beware that if you set yourself up as being a paragon of having high ethical standards, and then it is discovered that you're no better than anybody else, that there can be a real damage done because people say, oh, you're just being hypocrites. I think the risk mitigation is pretty easy here. We would have to have rigorous inspection, quality control of raw material as it comes in. We would have to have rigorous maintenance and cleaning timetables of the machinery in the factory. We'd have to be very careful about the storage and transport of the chocolate so it doesn't become contaminated or heat damaged or anything of that type. We would need to, after the chocolate bars, box of chocolate has been made for a couple of months, go and inspect them at random to make sure they're still okay. We can do toxicology reports perhaps and so on. There are all sorts of health and safety measures we can do in terms of the contamination. I think that's easy. On ethical sourcing of materials, I think it probably requires us to do some sort of inspection. We can, of course, initially get the suppliers of raw material maybe to fill in questionnaires and to set out what they pay people per hour and what the average rate is in that country and so on. We could insist that they have proper hours, so people are not being made to work 16 hours a day and so on. We could say that we want proper health facilities for your workforce and so on. It might be that also, we don't want bits of jungle to be chopped down, so you can plant chocolate producing vegetation instead. But I think at the end of the day, it will require some form of inspection. Either we fly inspectors out ourselves, although there's a carbon cost to that, or maybe we employ a firm of accountants to do a kind of environmental audit. A local firm of accountants in a country abroad, they do a kind of environmental audit according to our criteria and report back. They would all be fine methods, really, of trying to, first of all, protect our reputation, but also, ultimately, I'm assuming we actually want to do the right thing rather than just have a kind of marketing exercise. Requirement 2b deals with a newspaper article which has recently been published that relates to child labour in chocolate manufacturers, in certainly the sourcing of chocolate for chocolate manufacturers in the country. And that needs to be read. It talks about the average pay and so on there. It talks about starting at a very early age and so on. Kids working, not attending school, and the like. It says that I think the use of child labour is very extensive and so on. And it's clearly an issue which might or might not be of interest to consumers. The directors have looked at this and have come up with three different outcomes. The operations director effectively says that no response is required. The human resources director says the risk must be entirely removed at all costs. And the finance director says it should be controlled and monitored. So we have these three different views on what should be done about this alleged or actual child labour issue. And we have to prepare presentation slides. Remember, if you're doing slides, not to have too much on them. A slide is not something which has to be, or which certainly should be full of lots and lots of writing. This is slightly different because I've reproduced the requirements so I can talk about them. But if you're presenting people with arguments and new information, the amount of writing on a slide should be pretty much confined to keywords, which would then be expanded when the presentation takes place, expanded orally when the presentation takes place. And there's usual accompanying notes as well there, just to add a little bit as to what will be said, maybe when each slide comes up. And the first requirement in here is identify how each risk response would be categorized using an appropriate risk management framework. There's only 4 marks, so you're not going to have time to say a lot, certainly in the accompanying notes, but you have to think what would be an appropriate risk management framework. And it would seem to me that the one to use is the one which looks at the likelihood of a risk event occurring and the impact on the business if that does in fact occur. And then we can decide what to do about it. And some people talk about the Tower approach. And the Tower approach, the T is transfer, which would be to try and insure it, or maybe to get the risk handled by a subcontractor. I don't think it's going to work here at all. There is avoiding it, the risk entirely. Just do not go there, do not undertake this sort of activity. And I think that's pretty much really what the Human Resources Director is thinking about. Avoid it at all costs, remove it at all costs. There is the reduce, the R in here, which is very much this one here. And then there is the last one, no response, which is the last one here, which is accept. Sometimes you may have known this also as the 4 T's, where the 4 T's, the first is the same, transfer. Then there is terminate, which is avoid, really. There is reducing, which is treating. And then there is accepting, which is tolerate. Some people call it the 4 T's. I think the Tower is becoming more obvious. And it's just a matter of slotting into this framework what each of the directors is essentially suggesting. And as I say, there won't be very much time after that to say much about it. Indeed, nothing much needs to be said about it. Except that if you're saying reduce, if you're putting that onto the slide, then maybe the explanatory notes will say reducing means ameliorating the risk, reducing the effect in some way or another. Now, none of that is saying whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. Part 2 comes up then to say evaluate. In other words, evaluate's always two-handed, pluses and minuses going on in there. And we have to have in mind here skepticism skills. These directors have come up with 3 different potential solutions, and presumably they can't all be right. And skepticism implies that you will say that this is wrong, this is not going to work. I don't believe this sales forecast. I don't believe that this product is going to sell well. I don't believe that we are going to be successful in actually developing this product in the time and to the budget. Whatever it is, skepticism is asking you really to say, this ain't going to work. This is wrong. That's what you really need to bring through. And I think this is where in number 2, in particular, the skepticism skills can be demonstrated. So what we're looking at here, the operations director and the human resources director. So the human resources director says avoid. Now that will obviously get us in the clear from any kind of moral duty. But the downsides as well. If we're not buying any of the chocolate product, then of course we are not providing any income whatsoever for the farmers, and that might well be worse. I'm not advocating child labour, obviously. It does, I think, in the information say that the practice is almost universal. It's just the way it is. And even if we withdraw from buying a product and kind of retreat to the moral high ground, there'll be lots and lots of other markets, both here and chocolate manufacturers in other countries, who will not do that. And, to what extent are we actually going to be improving anything for the children who are being exploited? And anyway, will we be able to find another source of chocolate to allow our business to continue, where the treatment of employees is actually better? So evaluate, you're looking for pluses and minuses, pros and cons, yes and no, and so on. The Human Resources Director says, that's the Human Resources Director. The other guy, Operations Director. The Operations Director says, do nothing. This is absolutely the opposite, really, to take you the moral high ground. This person is saying, everyone's doing it. We're no worse than anyone else. They may even be saying the public doesn't know anyway very much about this. The public doesn't care, even if they did know, and so on. We just carry on as we are. The advantages, I suppose, here is that there's less disruption. Our costs won't go up. The disadvantage is that we might be wrong in accepting it, both morally and actually on a business sense, that maybe in the longer term our reputation will be sullied, that we begin losing sales from that. So this is where we come to judge. And I think we have to try and find, whatever you see, evaluate, even if it doesn't come easy, as it might not here in say, no response is the right one to do, just accept it. I think with evaluation, you have to always try and look for pluses and minuses. It doesn't have to be even pluses and minuses, but ideally pluses and minuses in each of these two options. Then the finance director. The finance director says control and monitor the risk. Consider the suggestions, including recommendations for 2 control activities which should be implemented. And basically the suggestion of the finance director is saying maybe the best we can do for these children is to try to encourage, maybe by contract, the farmers not to maybe employ children who are less than 14 or whatever you come down to a suitable age, or if you are employing them, maybe to at least give a decent wage, or to ensure that their hours are reasonable, that they can still go to school, and so on. We could say we'll pay you more if you do that, and so on. This is, I think the answer is trying to say, this is the suggestion which is probably likely to be best. We can improve matters, and maybe neither of the other 2 responses actually improves matters for these children. Here we are retaining some leverage, I think, over the suppliers of chocolate, and gently trying to kind of move them into a more humane kind of regime for these children. 2 control activities. One could be going and visiting. One could be asking for various returns, how many hours have these people worked, what are they being paid, let me see your wages bills, let me see the children's school reports and so on, if they're working more part-time and the like. There are, we mentioned before, sending out maybe an auditor there to do inspections for us, and the proper way maybe to do inspections is to do surprise inspections to make sure that we're getting the correct feedback and data. But I think a kind of interesting question, remember the skepticism bit, it expects you to really disagree with something and to suggest that something is really not correct or not possible.